Now, the rest of the story. Senator Steve seemed like such a good guy. For example, more than a century ago, he was so very concerned for the economic development of his home state of Illinois that he realized in order for Illinois to grow, it would require major rail service. And thus was conceived the magnificent line of commerce and communication from Chicago to the Gulf of Mexico, the Illinois Central Railroad. Now, Senator Steve's plan was to give the state large portions of federal land to sell in order to raise funds for the new railway. He pushed the plan hard all the way through Congress and into law in September of 1850. President Millard Fillmore signed the bill. Once the land grant became law, Senator Steve hurried home to convince the Illinois legislature. There were 3 popular plans for the project. Senator Steve would make certain that the plan he favored was adopted, and it was. And the brand new railway system was on its way to reality. But this is the rest of the story. The charter had been specific regarding how the Illinois Central would reach Chicago, but once inside the city limits, there would be problems. The obviously favorable route of entrance was already owned by another railroad, so Senator Steve went back to work. Assisted by the city's mayor, he planned another route, one that would take the Illinois Central into Chicago along the splendid shoreline of Lake Michigan. One minor difficulty: that shoreline property was not owned entirely by the city. In fact, there was a 16-acre access owned privately, one which would have to be purchased if the Illinois Central project were to be completely successful. The question was, what price would the owner put on this property of his once he realized how important it was? Well, the answer was $21,320. Oh, you bet the owner came out with a tidy profit. And considering he had not purchased the land all that long ago, it's been suggested he had anticipated the Illinois Central venture with profit in mind. But anyway, the ICR got its fabulous lakefront route into Chicago, which would be called the most magnificent entrance to a major city in all the world. And everybody was happy except the former owner of those 16 key acres. He had cashed in for tens of thousands. Oh, did I mention the shrewd real estate investor who had cleaned up in the Illinois Central deal? Almost as though he had had inside information. He had had inside information. The man who got rich by mid-19th century standards by predicting what the government was going to do was himself part of the government. He was the railroad planner, Senator Steve himself. Now, I know history, as you read it in school, relates that in the presidential election of 1860, Republican Abraham Lincoln narrowly beat Senator Steve, the mainline Democratic Party candidate, Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Well, now you know the American voters chose the right man. Because now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. You know, it seems as though politicians have been corrupt as long as there have been politicians. Mark Twain, whom I often quote, said, "Politicians in diapers must be changed often and for the same reason." And you know, I bet if you walked down any street in America and asked, who was Abraham Lincoln, I bet almost everyone could tell you something about him. But if you walked down those same streets and asked, who was Stephen Douglas, well, I doubt few people could answer correctly. Stephen Arnold Douglas was born in April 1813 in Brandon, Vermont. He was from a family of doctors and lawyers. His father, also named Stephen Arnold Douglas, was a doctor. His grandfather, Benijah Douglas, was an attorney. In 1830, Stephen's family moved from Vermont to New York City, where he eventually began studying to become an attorney. In 1833, 20-year-old Stephen moved westward, where conditions for admission to the bar were easier. He initially stopped in Cleveland, Ohio, where it would only take a single year to gain admission to the bar, to become an attorney. After being stricken and recovering from malarial typhoid, Stephen continued drifting and stopped off at Portsmouth, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, Louisville, Kentucky, and then St. Louis, Missouri. While in St. Louis, he heard about the thriving town of Jacksonville, Illinois. After earning enough money and a license to practice law in Illinois in March 1834, Stephen settled in Jacksonville. By this time, Stephen was already interested in politics and was known as a gifted orator. In 1836, he was elected to the Illinois House of Representatives. He joined a legislature which included 5 future senators, 7 future congressmen, and 1 future president. That future president was Abraham Lincoln. Now, I'll expand on him a little bit later. In 1838, Stephen ran for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, but lost by just 36 votes. In 1840, 27-year-old Stephen was appointed as the Illinois Secretary of State, the youngest person to ever hold that position. In 1841, Stephen accepted election to the Illinois Supreme Court, but resigned 2 years later when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. In 1847, he was elected to the U.S. Senate. I mean, he was on a meteoric rise in politics. But Stephen Douglas is certainly a controversial figure in American history, but not because of his underhanded land dealings that Mr. Harvey told us about. In 1847, Stephen married Martha Denny Martin and moved to Chicago, Illinois. Martha's father, the wealthy Colonel Robert Martin of North Carolina, owned a 2,500-acre cotton plantation and 100 slaves on the Pearl River in Lawrence County, Mississippi. In 1848, Colonel Martin appointed Stephen as the property manager of the plantation. As payment, Stephen received 20% of the income, not profit, income. But there was a problem. Stephen was a politician in a free state with presidential aspirations. Managing slaves on a Mississippi plantation? To distance himself from that plantation, he hired someone else to manage it for him, and at a much lower rate of pay, of course. Over and over again, Stephen's arguments in Congress were pro-slavery. Remember, he was earning 20% income from his father-in-law's Mississippi cotton plantation. In 1848, Colonel Martin died and Stephen's wife, Martha, inherited that cotton plantation and all of its slaves. Stephen's revenue from the plantation improved drastically. In 1853, Martha died at the young age of 28 after a short illness, and Stephen inherited the cotton plantation and its 100 slaves. Now, Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln are forever linked in our nation's history. In 1858, Lincoln ran against Stephen in the Senate election. Following his nomination, Lincoln delivered his House Divided speech. Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all of one thing or all of the other." Stephen Douglas disagreed that it couldn't continue and said Lincoln called for a war of secession, a war of the North against the South, of the free states against the slave states. It seems both of them were right in their predictions. In January 1859, Stephen Douglas was re-elected to a third term. The 1860 presidential election was certainly an unfair election. Let me explain. Abraham Lincoln's name did not appear on the ballots in 10 states: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. That meant that a fifth of the electoral votes were not even available to Lincoln. Lincoln didn't carry a single slave state, but he won all 18 free states. Despite getting less than 40% of the popular vote, Lincoln received 180 electoral votes and was elected president. Stephen Douglas returned to the Senate. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union. Within 3 weeks, 5 other Southern states did the same. In February 1861, Jefferson Davis became the President of the Confederate States of America. Stephen Douglas fought to prevent the breakup of the United States. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, when the South Carolina militia fired upon Fort Sumter. In the following month, Stephen became ill. Doctors assumed he would make a speedy recovery, but he contracted typhoid fever. 48-year-old Stephen Douglas died on June 3, 1861. There are many memorials to Stephen Douglas. One of the most notable is the Stephen A. Douglas Tomb and Memorial, located in part of the Douglas community, also named after Stephen Douglas, in Chicago. The land was originally owned by Stephen's estate, but was sold to the state of Illinois and became known as Camp Douglas because it served as a training grounds for Union soldiers during the Civil War, and then as a prisoner of war camp. The memorial stands at 96 feet tall and sits atop the grave of Stephen Douglas. A 10-foot-tall statue of Stephen Douglas stands atop the column. It's nearly twice as tall as Stephen was in life. He stood just 5 foot 4 inches tall. In 2020, 3 Illinois state representatives proposed tearing the monument down but leaving Stephen Douglas's grave intact. But so far, that hasn't happened. Until 2020, you could visit a park on the west side of Chicago dedicated to Stephen Douglas. But in 2020, the city of Chicago added an S to Douglas Park in honor of Frederick Douglass and his wife Anna. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who became a leader in the abolition movement, for the abolition of slavery in America. But in renaming that park, the officials didn't do their homework. Stephen Douglas got the last laugh. You see, originally, Stephen Douglas's last name was spelled with 2 S's, Douglass. He dropped the second S from his name in 1846. In the previous year, 1845, Frederick Douglass published his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. This autobiography became a bestseller and was influential in the promotion of the abolition of slavery. But Stephen Douglas wasn't the only member of his family to drop the second S from the last name. If we look at the weathered headstone for Stephen Douglas's father's grave, we can see that his last name was spelled with 2 S's. Dr. Stephen Arnold Douglas died in July 1813 when the politician Stephen Douglas was just over 2 months old, 32 years before Frederick Douglass wrote his autobiography. The headstone of Benijah Douglas, the politician's grandfather, also shows the spelling with 2 S's. Now take a look at this. This is the family of Dr. Stephen Douglas, father of the politicians. It lists his parents, who died years before Frederick Douglass published his autobiography, with the spelling of the last name as Douglas with 2 S's. If we take a look at the politicians' aunts and uncles' graves, you'll notice that those who died before 1846, the year Frederick Douglass published his autobiography, their last names are spelled with 2 S's. But if you look at those who died after the year Frederick published his autobiography, you'll see that Douglas is spelled with just a single S. The politician's only sibling, Sarah Arnold Douglas, who died in 1897, also changed the spelling of her last name to a single S. Did Stephen Douglas and other members of the Douglas family change the spelling of their last name to avoid being connected with Frederick Douglass? Should Stephen Douglas be removed from history? Or should we use those statues, paintings, and other memorials as a way to teach this and future generations that we should care for and respect all human beings despite our many differences? What do you think? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.